LegalizeFreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Beyond politics, poverty and war. LegalizeFreedom.com.
Greetings and welcome once again to LegalizeFreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffat, and my guest today is Gary Lachman, who joins us to discuss his book Beyond the Robot, the Life and Work of Colin Wilson. Colin Wilson was a literary and cultural rebel, and one of the most adventurous, hopeful and least understood visionary intellects of the past century. Author of over 100 books, including the 1956 classic The Outsider, Wilson purveyed a philosophy of mind power and human potential that made him arguably the only optimistic existentialist. In part 1, we outline Wilson's core philosophy and worldview, which saw the purpose, meaning and destiny of humanity, and indeed all life, in the evolution of consciousness toward ever more expansive states of complexity and awareness. Although Wilson felt that in many ways Western civilization has hit a dead end, he ultimately rejected responses rooted in nihilism and negativity. For Wilson, consciousness does not passively reflect the world. Rather, it reaches out and grabs it. Perception, he believed, is participatory, and we are active agents in shaping reality. However, our inculcated fear of responsibility, of freedom, and of our own creative capacity for greatness keeps most of us mired in a meaningless, mechanistic view of the universe, drifting between hedonism and despair. Many of us ask if there is more to life than this, and the answer is a resounding yes. As Wilson himself wrote, "My life's task is to light a fire with damp sticks. The drizzle falls incessantly. Yet I feel that if only I could really get the blaze started, it would become so large and so fierce that nothing could stop it." Hello and welcome, Gary, and thank you so much for joining us once again on LegalizeFreedom.com.
Entirely my pleasure, Greg.
Okay, Gary, today we're going to be discussing a book of yours. It was actually published last year, and it's entitled Beyond the Robot, the Life and Work of Colin Wilson. Before we get started, as per usual, just give listeners a little brief bio of yourself and a word about your work in general.
As Greg said, my name is Gary Lachman, and I'm a writer, more or less, I would say, of sort of history of consciousness or history of esoteric philosophy. And I used to be a musician many years ago in my late teens and early 20s in New York. I was in a band called Blondie, later went on to become quite successful. But it was around that time, in the mid-'70s, when I first came across the sort of thing that I write books about. And it's very apropos to say that, because it was indeed a book by Colin Wilson called The Occult that introduced me to all the sort of thing I've been reading about since then. That's 1975. And I've been writing about it pretty steadily for a little bit more than 20 years now. And generally it's about this kind of counter tradition in Western culture, what's called rejected knowledge, by the historian James Webb, which includes all these aspects of occultism or Gnosticism or esotericism. And on sort of the psychological side of that deals with phenomena, states of consciousness, higher consciousness, but also bleeding into the paranormal and occult phenomena, things of that sort. And as Greg mentioned, along with writing a book about the work of Colin Wilson and telling his story, I've written about people like Rudolf Steiner and C.G. Jung and Madame Blavatsky and Swedenborg, and also more general kind of histories of the whole story, the narrative of the influence of these esoteric ideas on the West.
Okay, so in my introduction to the show, I've set out for people who don't know briefly who Colin Wilson was and why his work's so important. But just for a personal perspective, you mentioned there briefly how you first encountered his work. Maybe you could just tell us a little bit more about, that first moment, or what you remember about finding that first book of his, why his work has been so important to you, and then again briefly just why and when this book. I mean, if anyone knows your work, then this will feel like something that was almost inevitable that you would do this. But just at what point you said, okay, the Colin Wilson book, now is the time.
Right. Well, sadly, it was because of his. He passed away. He died in 2013. But I mean, I first came across, as I mentioned, his book, The Occult, when I was living in New York. I was playing bass guitar in Blondie. This is before I became, very famous, and we were living in this sort of very rundown loft space on the Bowery, and I wasn't interested in anything about the occult before this. I mean, aside from sort of horror films or H.P. Lovecraft and sort of weird fiction, but I didn't sort of particularly interested in the paranormal or the esoteric or anything like that for real. But I had read philosophy and people like Nietzsche and Jung and Hesse and people of that sort, and kind of the counterculture sort of canon, Alan Watts and Suzuki and things of that kind. But in the sort of milieu I was in, the people I knew, there were a lot of books from that generation, sort of the 60s into the early 70s generation, when they were very interested in the occult. It was the occult revival. In fact, my first book, Turn Off Your Mind, is about the occult revival of the 1960s and its influence on pop culture. But I remember coming across, and also where we were living in this loft space, there was this artist, this very flamboyant, wild character, who was very much into Aleister Crowley, famous, infamous magician of the 20th century, and he would do these sort of impromptu tarot card readings with one of the Crowley deck, which at that time it was still rather rare. So I found myself living in this kind of sort of milieu again, where even though it wasn't kind of the central thing at the time, these sort of occult, mystical, magical ideas were still kind of around. And I just remember, because of this fellow getting interested in Crowley, and so I picked up a book of his off somebody's bookshelf, and then I also saw this book, this thick book, The Occult, and I picked it up, and I just remember what interested me about it immediately, aside from the fact that I was getting interested in this occult stuff because of where I was that he was talking about people like Nietzsche or Camus or Sartre or psychologists or philosophers, and it wasn't just sort of a book of spells, or it wasn't a sort of history of hauntings or things of that sort. It was something about consciousness. It was something much more about the powers of the mind. And I didn't know any, it just was, I hadn't read anything like this before, the way he talked about Hesse and people like this. And there were people I knew about, and there were people I didn't know. And he just had such a good style. It was such a wonderful, readable narrative style. And I just became sort of, just a fan, just from starting reading it. And not that many years later, but some years later, I mean, as time went on, I was playing in Blondie and then in my own band. I had a band called No. The name of the band, it was like based on my interest in Gnosticism. So this was one of the things that grew out of reading occult and other books about the occult at that time. So I was reading, because also at the time there was a kind of big occult boom. There were a lot of sort of cut price, discount, reprinted occult classics, very cheap in New York at that time. So just as I was getting interested in it, there was a lot of it around. So I just started, gobbling up as much of it as I could and reading it and all that. So I just developed a real fascination with it. And but Wilson's book just opened me up to so many other things, because as you say, one of the things that he does is he writes about a lot of other people and material, and he puts them together. He makes a whole out of these otherwise rather disparate kinds of things, or things that are sort of kind of related, but they're not, they're the way they fit together into a kind of intelligible kind of picture of things isn't immediately accessible. And some years later, about 1983, after reading many of his books and hunting them down in bookshops in the States, and I'll get on to his most famous book, the one you mentioned already, The Outsider, which is he was most famous for. But I went on this kind of mini search for the miraculous in Europe, in England, and then onto the continent. And part of which involved my going down to Mevagissey, which was down in Cornwall, here in the UK, almost at the end, which is where he lived from the sort of late 50s on. I went down there and just spent a day, and he was very, very friendly, and we just discussed his ideas about consciousness and phenomenology and existentialism and all this sort of stuff. And then after that, maintained a correspondence, and over the years I visited down there again, and he at one point he came to Los Angeles, where I was living at the time, and he stayed with me while he was giving a series of talks around there. So we developed a friendship but in the sense, obviously, he had many other people who were interested in his books and sought him out and talked to him. He was very generous. His place down in Cornwall became a kind of conduit, because anybody was going down that part of the world who was interested in any of these kinds of things. And Wilson wrote about so many different things. That's one of the aims of Beyond the Robot, is to show that even though he wrote about so many different things, he wrote about the occult, he wrote about philosophy, he wrote about crime, he wrote about sex, he wrote about psychology. They're all related. They're all linked together. They all come out of a central kind of question for him, which is what he calls the paradoxical nature of freedom. So I, and at one point, I started writing books myself when I moved from Los Angeles to London in 1996. I started writing articles in the early 90s and book reviews while I was still in Los Angeles and doing different things. I was working at a New Age bookshop for a while called the Bodhi Tree. This is one of the most, it doesn't exist anymore, but for a while it was the most famous sort of metaphysical bookshop west of the Rockies. And I was working as a science writer for a while. But basically, they went through sort of midlife crisis and was flown across the Atlantic to London. Just started writing full on since then.
Yes, well, you mentioned Colin Wilson's The Occult, which is actually published in 1971, as that was your first encounter with him. And that, as I mentioned to you off air, was mine as well. I think I told you in a previous interview, actually, that when I was getting into this sort of stuff, which is when I was a teenager, shall we just say, the esoteric, the unusual, the bizarre, the paranormal. There was nothing in the little town I lived in that would cater for any of that. Mail order was a little bit difficult because not very many people did this stuff that means. But in the neighbouring town, which was about 15 miles away, there was a guy who had a little ramshackle bookstore in basically a covered market. And I say bookstore, it was essentially what looked like a storage unit with books piled from floor to ceiling, and he sat in there looking like a cat weasel, kind of smoking little roll-ups, and there never seemed to be anyone in there apart from him. But that's where I found my copy of The Occult, and drawn actually by the cover artwork. It wasn't the lurid green cover that...
Oh, right. Which one was that?
The one I have has got black with some kind of occult-type symbolism, some kind of esoteric magical symbolism on the front. So I don't know if it was a later edition or not. I can see it from here, but I can't reach it, unfortunately.
Oh, right. Yeah, well, he said he detested that sort of horrible green, but they stood out. To tell you, that's one thing I remember. Looking out for. There was that whole series of his paperbacks paperback novels and other books that I guess it was Granada put them out, and Panther, and they were more or less dark cover, but they had his name, in very bold white sort of print. Very recognizable, striking kind of covers. But the Cup of the Occult I had was an American edition, and it had this strange kind of psychedelic, weird, almost fractal, illustration on it.
Yeah, I suspect the one I've got is just a later reprint, later edition, and they just got rid of the green cover, maybe because of negative feedback from him.
Yeah.
But, and I went back to the same bookstore, and then I found another one of his books, which was The Outsider, as you mentioned, his first book, which is published in 1956.
I didn't read The Outsider until a couple years later, myself, because, like yourself, I was very much initially interested in, all the occult, material, and there was so much after just reading his book, The Occult. There was Crowley, and there was Gurdjieff and Uspensky, and just as I said, unlike yourself, when I was living in New York, there was just a lot of stuff. There was stuff about the Golden Dawn. There was Israel Regardie's books, and then the UK seemed to be producing lots of stuff. Francis King was another one who wrote about Crowley and sex and magic and things like that, and of course there was the wonderful Morning of the Magicians, which was one of these books that is full of errors, and it's just in many ways just wrong, but it's also very exciting and stimulating kind of book. And so but when I left Blondie and moved to Los Angeles, and I kind of started again, I remember finding Outsider. I tell the story. I wrote about it somewhere. I don't remember exactly, but I'm actually, after leaving Blondie and then being in LA, before I got my own band together, I had to, just basically, get a job, and I wound up, going, looking for work. At one point, being just very, very discouraged, and I remember going to a bookshop to look for work in the bookshop, and it was just very, very discouraging and all that, and decided I was going to sort of console myself by buying a book or something and, forget about looking for work. And I remember looking, and what I found was Wilson's The Outsider, and it was actually probably the right time and place, because it spoke to me. Yes, I'm one of these characters. And yes, you're right, it's not about the occult. It starts out, it's about existentialism. It's about this figure, this kind of character in society, alienated, seeking this kind of more intense experience, what in the Gospels they call life more abundant. I would say, if you know Wilson's work, and if you read that, and because that's the book he always refers to in practically all of his other books. He talks about these characters, the outsiders, and they're all different ones, but they all share this kind of common, this kind of hunger or search for intensity, for deeper meaning and purpose, and a more powerful kind of experience of consciousness. His first book, this is one that you said before, it came out in 1956 when he was 24, and worldwide famous, for a while. And then he became infamous. The press and the critics turned against him, and that's another story, and I tell in the book. But the same kind of intensity of consciousness that he was talking about in, say, paranormal or mystical occult terms in the occult, it grows out of this obsession that he had himself, and that he also saw in these figures like Nietzsche or T.E. Lawrence, or the painter Van Gogh, or Nijinsky, the dancer, and many others who either went mad or blew their brains out or sought out some kind of danger in order to feel this kind of more intensity of experience. And I remember at the time when I found The Outsider, that book, I just, I related to it, very much, and that's not too unusual experience, because there were many people who, when the book came out, it was very, popular, and then also some, famous people were quite, taken with it. But I didn't come across it until, it came out, as you said, 56. I came across it in 1977, so it's 21 years later. But I was about 21 years old when I came across it, so it really struck me, and also in my own position, in a smaller way, where I had I've been involved. Blondie, I left them when they were just about on their way to become, very famous and successful. I had some success with them. A couple songs of mine, did well, so on. But I had kind of left that to do pursue my own, ideas, my own musical, work. And so I became an outsider. And so I very much identified with this theme, and he explores it in a variety of these different people. And also, again, I had read about existentialism as many people did, Sartre and Camus, and books like Nausea and the Sisyphus and the Stranger, and so on. So he's talking about these kinds of themes, and it's all about it. Again, it's about meaning and purpose and facing nihilism and this kind of tension between ultimate yes and ultimate no. And the outsider is someone who has this kind of double vision. He sees this vision of chaos and absurdity, but then every now and then he has these sudden overwhelming moments of affirmation. The world seems transformed, and it's seen as eternally good. This kind of Blakean vision of the world, as it truly is, eternal and all that. So that's that kind of tension in these characters he's writing about. And then in the books that follow The Outsider, in fact, just recently I wrote an introduction to a new edition of his second book called Religion and the Rebel, which was completely trashed when it came out, and in some ways would have ended many other sort of people's careers, but Wilson carried on. But he develops these ideas that he first proposes in The Outsider in different ways, and in one he sees, can we find a religious solution to the outsider's problems, and then he sort of writes himself through these different possibilities, and then after the first two books, which have a kind of intensity and very romantic passion, he actually becomes more the kind of writer that he's going to be for the rest of his career, which is very readable, but much less sort of passionate, intense, and more and more just interested in the ideas themselves, and becoming more clear with himself that he's seeing a way through to somehow answer the outside or solve the outsider's dilemma, which is essentially a way of achieving these kind of states of affirmation at will, consciously, with not relying on them happening by chance.
Well, Wilson was not only unusually prolific as a writer, I mean, he ranged widely across topics, as we've already hinted at, in contrast to a trend which would have been in place then, but it's kind of like a Enlightenment sort of trend or a scientific age trend of specialism. He was definitely a big picture guy. That's what makes him not only so readable, but so attractive to a certain type of mind that's, magpie-like, is interested in everything, because everything's inherently interesting. And his multi and interdisciplinary approach, I think, is very important. And that's one of the kind of corners we painted ourselves into these days, is being unable to see the big picture because we're focusing in on little details and getting lost in them, and we're failing to pick up on things from one discipline that actually inform important aspects of another, and therefore we're really kind of venturing down all these millions of little cul-de-sacs when actually a lot of ideas and concepts and insights it brought together would give us perhaps a more of a light bulb moment about things that we're searching for. And in many ways, people who are critical of Wilson can sort of say he's just dipping his toe into all these things and superficially, and there's just too many ideas. But of course, the whole point is when you do look at the big picture as he did, in some ways, there's essentially one idea, really. The one idea for me reading Wilson is that kind of our civilization at the time when he started writing, and is even more relevant today, has kind of hit a bit of a dead end. The evolution of the species, our species, is about the evolution of consciousness, and that's kind of what I take away from it, and that's what I see between the lines, and often closer to the surface than that in everything that he's written.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, he felt that we actually, all appearances to the contrary, we were on sort of the brink of a possible evolutionary leap, because of the insights that he felt he had achieved into consciousness and its history. And one of the things he talks about is, the development of the imagination, the 18th century on, with the rise of the modern novel and then Romanticism, and how these in themselves show a distinct shift, change, and development in consciousness away from the kind of enlightenment. Which at the same time, Wilson isn't a rationalist. He's very rational. I mean, he's very scientific. He started out in his early days as an adolescent. He had a deep interest in science, and that was the first thing he wanted to do. And it was only after he got into his sort of later teens and he started writing and going through these kinds of sort of existential, the experiences he had, became suicidal at one point and so on, that he realized that actually what, he wanted to do was to write and to explore this kind of question of the meaning of human life, the meaning of human existence. So he doesn't want to sort of jettison the scientific, but he wants to broaden it. He writes about romantics very much in the kind of ecstatic states that the romantic poetry and, Shelley and Keats and Wordsworth and so on, but he's also critical of the kind of overindulgence in the sort of ecstatic states, because he's very much about learning control of consciousness, and control is a bad word, but they can control in the same way of someone driving a car, or someone playing a musical instrument, or doing any creative work in that sense, where the Enlightenment view, or the sort of what's usually called sort of the Cartesian view, is that consciousness is a sort of passive mirror. It reflects the world out there, and it does it whether it wants to or not. There's no sort of effort, there's no exertion behind it. We open our eyes, we just see it, it's there. But through his reading of German philosopher Edmund Husserl in the early 20th century, who developed this philosophical method called phenomenology, out of which later more culturally widely known movements like existentialism grew. Wilson came to understand that this was an inaccurate view of how consciousness actually works. Husserl said that perception is intentional. We're not aware of this intention consciously, but there is a kind of subconscious exertion or will to perceive. And one of the examples Wilson gives is that, if you're in a hurry or if your mind's elsewhere and you look at your watch to see what time it is, you may physically see the watch, the sense impressions have registered in that sense, but because your mind is elsewhere, which is a curious way to talk about it, you didn't take in the time. And so you may have seen it, but you didn't actually remember it. So you didn't intend it enough. You didn't intend viewing, and so you actually have to go back and make some kind of little effort to be able to actually take in the time. And this is the sort of the fundamental insight that Wilson takes from Husserl and phenomenology, and which he says later philosophers like Heidegger and Sartre and other existentialists sort of lost track of, is this intentional element in all of our perception. And he links this intentionality to mystical states, or a term he borrows from the American psychologist Abraham Maslow, who's the sort of father of humanist psychology. Peak experiences, these sudden moments of joy, or what the writer G.K. Chesterton called absurd good news. It's this sudden moments of delight, or deep contentment, and these are states that, for Wilson, show that the kind of passive, static consciousness that the modern West, since the Enlightenment, the kind of clockwork, human beings are sort of like stimulus response robots, as John Locke said. There's nothing in the mind that didn't get there first through the senses. So, from that point of view, unless you have any kind of sensory input, our minds are sort of empty, like an empty flat. Go out and buy stuff to fill it up with, and so. But Wilson is saying, no, it's not like that. The mind is actually, it's not this kind of box that things get put into. It's actually a kind of reaching out. It's reaching out to whatever it is out there. That's beyond us, but through its intentions and through its structuring of our experience, it kind of creates the world around us. And so this gives the mind and consciousness a much more creative, powerful, intentional aspect. And this was the kind of thing that he looked into, or he investigated, he explored, from more than 50 years in about 200 books. I forget the exact figure, but as you said, he was prolific.
One of the things that I always found so refreshing about Colin's writing and his ideas, and again, you've touched on this a few times there, is the essential optimism, this kind of forward thrust. For me, I was always turned off in philosophy and other quote-unquote disciplines by the underlying sense, and sometimes very much this came to the surface, a sense of nihilism and misanthropy and this kind of Malthusian rancor, often driven, it occurred to me, by the people propagating this by their own self-loathing. That's what it seemed to me. Or in the case of someone, for example, like a popular writer today, like Richard Dawkins, by their own self-regard. Self-loathing, self-regard, can be two sides of the same coin. And I remember, again, around the time when I first picked up on Wilson, I say 84, 85, at school at that time, in literature classes, we were being forced to read Graham Greene, Thomas Hardy, and I was just
these are the people he detests.
In despair. Why are we reading this bullshit? Because it's like, what I kept thinking was, in all these characters and all their choices, it is a choice. Think differently, and you can change this. And there's just this sense of inevitable doom about it all that I just could not stand. The only book in recent times that although I tend to finish all the books I start, the only one I've ever had a red pen out and written all over, and I was reading it with a view to interviewing the author, and at the end of it I thought, I'm not doing this. I'm not doing this. It was the philosopher John Gray. And
right.
It was his book.
Well, he's another doomsayer.
Yeah, it was his book Black Mass, and it's the only thing that I've defaced with a red pen. So the essential thrust here was that Wilson, with him, I just felt like this is someone else who thinks like me. Not saying that I aspire to somehow be such a thinker on a level with Colin, or to express myself in that way. But the point was, I felt there was a kindred spirit there. And it's why that after reading one of his last books, Superconsciousness, I resolved to interview him, and I was so disappointed and upset to find out that he actually passed away shortly after, so.
It is a shame, yeah. No, but I agree with you. I think, and this is exactly what Wilson says in his books about literary criticism, literature, is this whole tone of pessimism. I mean, I guess the idea is that it somehow seems more serious, more mature, more real, in quotation marks, because I guess the assumption is, yes, we would all like the world to be much nicer. Would hope you know what I mean. There'd be reason for optimism and all that kind of thing, but we also know it's not really like that, and so on and so on. And this is the kind of thing that he sort of argued against and made him so unfashionable. Greene was, someone he loves to tell the story about when Graham Greene was a teenager, and was bored to tears. He found a revolver in his brother's, dresser drawer or something, and, took it out to the common and put a bullet in it and spun the chambers and played Russian roulette. And as Greene tells it, he wrote about, is that when, and this is a story Colin told and we told many, many times, when he pulled the trigger and the hammer hit an empty chamber, he went from being so bored to death that he was willing to take a risk on blowing his brains out to get, the slightest kick out of anything, to suddenly seeing everything in this incredibly intense, meaningful, way, and everything was radiating this, notion of possibilities. And it's sort of like, well, it wasn't as if this vision, possibility, interest, and wonder just was turned on. What had happened is something happened to Greene. Greene, and Wilson says, is the threat of having his brains blown up, forced. He concentrated. That's the whole thrill of the Russian play. You sort of kicked him out of this lethargy, out of this kind of boredom, and for a brief moment, he had this vision. But apparently, Greene wasn't able to hold on to it because he kept, playing Russian roulette. I mean, he was very bad at it because he kept doing it apparently a few times. He kept doing it enough to get bored even with that. So you you sort of wonder. He's incredibly lucky. Where he was just really, really bad. And he also less so Hardy. But Hardy is someone that Wilson says is another one who seems to have this vision of a kind of malevolent universe. Something even worse than the indifferent kind of universe of Camus. The world is actually actively out to get you. But again, why is it that that's taken seriously? And say, the kind of absurd good news of Chesterton, or the sort of peak experiences of Maslow, or Blake's, kind of vision. It has to be, cultural, I guess, and I guess it's also kind of atmosphere of suspicion. The philosopher Paul Ricoeur, he talked about the hermeneutics of suspicion and how, Marx, Freud, Nietzsche too, the critical, skeptical Nietzsche. Although Nietzsche himself is another one who has this vision of, yay-saying, vision of power, and the Dionysian, and this kind of life affirmation. He's someone who had the most wretched life possible. I mean, this is one of the funny things, Schopenhauer, Nietzsche's sort of mentor originally, was absolutely pessimistic. He's another one who Wilson takes to task, and, he completely condemned him as being, sort of pointless, and, it was best not to be born. But he lived a, fairly well-off life. He was very comfortable and, life, and meanwhile, Nietzsche was the most wretched creature around. Lonely, moving from cheap little rented room to rented room, trying to find good weather to live in so he wouldn't have migraines and all that. And yet he develops this incredibly affirmative philosophy in the face of all this pain and suffering. So this is the kind of thing that Wilson wants to find a way to get to, is this kind of sudden, overwhelming eruption of yay saying. It's a kind of, it's this energy that we have inside us somewhere, that and it's not only that, because with that energy coming up, our intentionality grows, and we actually we perceive that the universe is meaningful. It's not just we feel really good and it's still a meaningless universe. We actually see that there is this meaning there, that the low energy and the low pressure and the low intentionality has blinded us to. But now we can actually see that it's there, and what he wanted to do was develop a way to get to it, intentionally. And, he knew he was going against the tide. And, this is something, in fact, there was a review of the book in the Times Literary Supplement, and he's actually a friend of mine who wrote it. But he completely dismissed it. But again, it's this whole idea that you can't take any of this seriously in the kind of official or orthodox, literary world and all that. But, Wilson didn't care. I mean, he outwrote all of the critics of the time. And, alongside the official culture, the official establishment has grown up this whole other, whatever you want to call it, New Age or the alternative, whatever, it's there. And these are the people that are, going to be interested in these ideas, and it doesn't matter anymore whether the academics are interested in them or not. Well, I think Wilson is going to get discovered by the academics soon, because one of the things in academia is that one runs out of things to study. So you need to get new things. I mean, even academic esotericism on the rise for the last couple decades. At one point, academia wouldn't touch the esoteric, with the barge pole, but now it's, become most of the new work being done sort of in esoteric studies is kind of academic. So this is one reason why Colin Stanley, who's Colin Wilson's bibliographer, he established his Colin Wilson Archive in Nottingham University. He donated a large collection of Wilson's books of his own, and has also been bringing Wilson's papers from Cornwall up there. So, I think, and in fact, next year we're going to have the second Colin Wilson conference there. There was one last year. But in a way, I mean, I'm happy for all that to happen, but it doesn't really matter. I think in one way what's really important is that the people who understand these ideas and appreciate them, they're the ones who get to know about them. Not so much some entrenched kind of world that you need to convince the importance. You want these ideas to reach people who are already kind of open to this sort of thing.
Yeah, well, I think the key for me, personally, coming through from reading Colin's work, lies in, I'm paraphrasing your words now, from the book, and also something you said a few minutes ago, that consciousness does not passively reflect the world, that our perception is participatory, it actively reaches out and grabs what's there. And for me, that's summed up in a kind of a philosophical trope or meme of mine, is that what you look for, you find, and also that you get what you give. And that's kind of things that I always have in mind. And that as far as this mass consciousness and where we're at and what the attitudes that dominate our thinking currently and have done for some time is actually in itself maladjusted and suboptimal. But that, of course, is, if it's the norm, then our tendency now is to try and adjust to that, to the median, what is seen as acceptable within a certain framework, within certain limits. And I remember reading the work of Joseph Chilton Pearce, another fellow who's sadly now passed on, but I did manage to interview before he died. And his work was all about how we become adjusted to a dysfunctional society and are then seen as well adjusted because we're fitting into utter madness.
Yes. No, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. I think, Wilson, as I said, his first book is The Outsider, and that remained central to all of his work until his last years. But again, it's not sort of just the social misfit, because I think the whole idea is that Wilson's aware of the pressure. I mean, there's a great deal of pressure. That's the whole thing. Life is tough, to put it very simply. And it's modern life is increasingly becoming more and more complex and abstract and sort of managed. The individual is more and more looked at as a unit, a functional unit to be sort of, managed within the society to, basically to the greater good of all. But again, it's for Wilson, the outsider is someone who at first, starts out feeling this alienation, but it's a peculiar kind of alienation because it is about this kind of need for this kind of this hunger for a kind of purpose and meaning, a kind of seriousness about life. So it's not just sort of like the beatnik or the hippie or the punk or the sort of social misfit. Okay, you have that, but it's also someone who wants to achieve something more than the conformity, but wants to do that by sort of pushing into an area where there's even more. It's a kind of self-discipline. This is fundamentally what Wilson arrives at as the kind of at least the sort of absolute beginning of any kind of resolution to the outsider's problems. He has to find a way to discipline his own consciousness so that he doesn't succumb to the despair and the kind of sense of meaninglessness or resentment. That's the other thing too. There are a lot of this is his area when he writes about crime, because he writes about these characters that are sort of in a way, in this kind of strange, warped way, they pursue crime and violent sexual crime and murder as almost a kind of creative act, because their own sense of self, their own sense of being has become so minimal and so frustrated that it's only through this kind of radical kind of act that they achieve a brief sense of release and a sense of being authentic. He's not condoning that, obviously not, but he's saying look to what extent human psychology can be driven if the kind of creative aspects of ourselves, the precisely what you're saying, the need not to find yourself to fit in, not to adjust to something that's evidently not creative and not inducive to you. The outsiders are these characters who seek this kind of deeper, more intense meaning. And in some ways, I mean, although Wilson started out as you can say kind of a rebel, he then became quite disillusioned with characters that kind of stay at that level. I mean, he definitely kind of outgrew the bohemian kind of world, or let's say the countercultural kind of world. As I said, his later books became they have a kind of what do you want to say? There's almost a scientific character to them, but I don't mean that in a dry, reductive sense. I mean the sense that he's fascinated, he's interested, but he's no longer sort of like, he doesn't complain about society so much as he puts more of the emphasis on the individual. I think this is what you get. The first two books, in fact, Religion and the Rebel. This is his. Not that he's ever really pessimistic, but this is the book in which he really sort of talks about, Western society is on its way out, and outsiders are pimples that appear on the face of, this decaying world and all that. And he kind of wrote out a lot of his anger that he had, and it was also because, he realized that his fame was at first exhilarating and absolutely intoxicating. It was brief, and then he found out that no one really understood the ideas he was talking about. He wasn't famous for the ideas about the outsider. He was famous because he was very young when the book came out, and he was associated with these group of writers called the Angry Young Men. And he didn't really have anything to do with them so much because they were mostly concerned about social issues, whereas Wilson was really concerned about what I said fundamentally were sort of religious or existential issues, like what was the meaning of my existence, whereas most of his contemporaries were more driven by sort of socialists or Marxists or some kind of political vision. And his kind of views were considered to be sort of reactionary.
Extending the positivity, negativity thought experiment of like our, the human condition and where we are and where we're going, and how, as I've said earlier, how I took exception to this sort of overwhelming negativity and just felt that in itself was a choice, and that we are free to choose how we respond to circumstances. And an important aspect in Colin's work is, our ideas about who we are and what's possible. And he draws upon something, or mentions something called the Jonah complex, which was developed by an earlier writer. You can remind us who that was. And essentially that we have this sort of like fear of greatness or possibility, what we might be able to do. And that's very much a kind of a peer pressure thing. And in an environment of like negativity, then people who are being positive, as we mentioned earlier, in itself can be seen as kind of like, oh, well, that's all well and good, but actually life is serious. And that's strange in itself, because you mentioned earlier seriousness about life, but that is seen as almost like, well, if you're serious about life, then somehow you have to be pessimistic and restricted. But that again is just one view that just doesn't hold up. And I think a lot of people are actually afraid of what they might be able to do. And also the idea of them maybe not doing it or not achieving it or not even going for it. So therefore it's easier to imagine that it can't be done, because wouldn't it be awful to think that you could have done X, Y, and Z or been X, Y, and Z, but you didn't even try. So better to imagine that you just can't do it. Whereas, as you point out and highlighting in Colin's work and in your own, actually ceding control and taking that attitude can be actually catastrophic.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, this is something that different writers, different thinkers have pointed out. You say the Jonah complex. I believe this comes from Abraham Maslow, and it's the biblical story where Jonah is trying to run away from his fate, fated to be a prophet, but he doesn't want to do that. He doesn't want the responsibility. Maslow sort of illustrated this by telling a story of how when he was teaching class psychology, he asked, who among you believe that you're going to make some, vital contribution to, your field of study. And nobody raised their hand. He said, well, if you're not, then who? The whole idea, there's a certain diffidence where you're not supposed to feel that you're going to. And if you do, you're sort of seen as being sort of, conceited or somehow, feeling superior and so on and all that. But Wilson writes about this kind of feeling in a book called, in the UK it was called The Age of Defeat. I first read it in the US under the title The Stature of Man. That was the US publishers wanted something a bit more upbeat. But it was fundamentally about sort of the loss of the hero and this kind of rise of conformity. It sort of charts the rise of the kind of keeping up with the Joneses sensibility. Loss of the individual, and the individual becoming much more of a company man, the organization man sort of thing. And this kind of, the individual is insignificant. That sensibility infecting, the literature of the time. People, you mentioned Green, but also characters, writers like Huxley and Lawrence and Hardy, and there's the Sartre. Samuel Beckett is one of his bêtes noirs, the Irish writer famous for Waiting for Godot and other sort of works of kind of absurdist black theater. He absolutely detested Beckett's work. He thought he was a nice guy. He met him, and he said he felt too polite to say anything about how much he hated his work to him. But again, it's just this kind of vision of meaninglessness and life being a kind of joke. No, Wilson rebelled against that, and he wanted to develop a kind of vision of a sort of successful character, not successful in the sense of being rich or getting the girl and all that, but having a consciousness that doesn't fail. And he sort of looks back to the early romantics and the sort of first wave romantics who were tight. They were quite strong and powerful, and they confronted the world. But then after that, it seemed to be that, yes, that was all nice, that sounded great, but actually no, in the end, sort of the world wins. The world is being this dim, vast veil of tears and all that. And this is something that, again, that whole idea of seriousness being sort of linked to a sense of defeat and pessimism and all that, which I guess, Wilson can appreciate the sort of kind of undefeated vision of, say, Hemingway, when Hemingway says a man can be destroyed but not defeated. And he says, yes, he can, that toughness, that kind of stoicism, he can appreciate that. But he said, what if you don't want to be destroyed or defeated? And again, there's a whole canon. One could put together, and that's what Wilson does in many of his books, puts together a canon of these kind of optimistic thinkers. And again, they're not optimistic thinkers, and they're not Pollyannas. Nietzsche's no Pollyanna. Wilson's no Pollyanna. He writes about sex murders, encyclopedias of crime, and intensely aware of the darkest aspect of existence. So it isn't this kind of blind optimism where everything is hunky dory. No, it's just in the face of all that. It's a vision of strength in the face of that, and it's a vision of a kind of ultimate good, or at least of a kind of ultimate triumph over evil, over the darkness and all that. But what he sees in, as you're saying, what he sees in modern literature is this kind of canonization of the pessimistic vision, and as you say, it becomes identified with being realistic and being serious and all. But even that kind of tragic view has become, with postmodernism, it's just a kind of joke. Life is meaningless, yes, so what else is new? Beyond even the kind of tragic view that Wilson was trying to rally against. And also in philosophy, he was writing about existentialism, and he also wrote a bit in later years about postmodernism and deconstructionism, both of which, not surprisingly, he was very critical about.
I very well recall being at school and growing up with this kind of sense of impossibility, that we'd been born into defeat, that I just couldn't identify with, but that just seemed to be the dominant paradigm. And it was summed up as when I was a child, and actually had a very happy upbringing, despite parents splitting up. But the phrase that I remember most when I was running around wide-eyed, full of wonder at the world, was, don't get too big for your boots. It was kind of like, yeah, okay, but maybe rein in what you think, because, other people are kind of looking on and they might not approve. If you think you're great, or you want to do something, or you've got something ambitious, it's like, yeah, okay, but, just bear in mind that other people haven't really done anything, and they never really will, so you don't want to make them feel bad. So maybe just keep all that to yourself. And it's like the crabs in the bucket thing, isn't it? If one crab's about to get out of the bucket, then some of the other crabs will try and pull that crab back down. No, you're not getting out of the bucket because you'll show the rest of us up. And I remember one interview in particular towards the end of school with our biology teacher, who was also the careers counsellor. And I was so into music when I was a teenager, as a lot of teenagers are. I'm sure you were exactly the same. And I said to him, the interview was like, okay, you're leaving soon. What do you think they might like to do? Can we help with that? And I said, well, I'm really not sure about anything specific, but I would love to do something in music, because that's what really gives my life meaning. It's what I'm really passionate about. Yep. And his essential response was, perhaps you should be a bit more realistic. Mm-hmm. And it was 10 years later, I joined a successful band, sold 1 million, and it was kind of like, well, there you are. And that's because I didn't pay any attention.
Did you send him a copy?
I didn't know. I think he might have been dead at that point, so I didn't want to upset his widow. So,
well, what can you say?
Well, the point being that this stuff is inculcated in us from the earliest days.
No, it's true. I mean, people often say to me, because I live in England, we're always taught to, know our place and so and so. But you Americans, you just go for it and all that. But, it's not really the case. I mean, there is that sense of Americans can do anything, all that kind of thing. But there's just as many diffident, lazy, and sort of basically scared, people there as here. And what I was going to say, there's that Heinrich Ibsen, the playwright. He said, you want to be yourself, watch out for your friends. People want to keep you in some place. And I had a similar experience when I was a teenager, saying how I wanted to do music and blah, 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 blah. And an uncle who said, oh, you're never going to do anything. And I think I did send him a copy of something. But, Wilson faced that himself. He writes about all these long years of apprenticeship, and he was learning to be a writer. Again, that's probably even more. You think of the kind of kitchen sink scenario of, Billy Liar, let's say, or something like that, where, someone's got dreams. Billy Liar, that film, Tom Courtenay, he's someone who's got the dreams, but he doesn't transform them into reality. And when he comes to face up the possibility of doing it, he himself doesn't have the kind of courage or strength or whatever you need to actually transform it. Whereas Wilson himself in his own life, and again, this is something about him. Not only did he write about these outsider characters, he himself lived that life. He left school at 16 or 17 or whatever, and then tramped around and, was in and out of the RAF, and then slept rough, and then hitchhiked all over, France and England, and wrote, and, never stayed at a job long enough to get bored from it and all that. And I tell that story in the early chapters of the book. So, he lived the sort of thing he was writing about, and he had to face all of that resistance, and even more in many ways after he had actually made it. Imagine, the resistance you face in your early years just for your immediate social world and your family and all that. And then actually one morning you wake up and the country is resounding with your name, with praise about you in all the newspapers, which is what happened for Wilson. And the Outsider came out. Every newspaper in the country was saying was agreeing with him, something that he knew for a long time, but it took, 10 years for others to recognize that he was a genius and all that sort of thing. And then, though, they turn against him. So you would think, oh, that you've overcome it finally, but no, it's just there. And he himself, he says he's very Darwinian when it comes to sort of creativity and writers, and he believes in the survival of the fittest. So he doesn't think things should be made easy. He even thinks outsiders have it quite easy today. But still, it's basically up to, as I said before, he puts the onus more on the individual than the society. Get over your self-pity and all that, and get out there and do it, rather than complain that, I really want to be creative or whatever it is, but, I can't do this, I can't do that because of society holds me back or something like that. He was very much about, the individual taking responsibility and, taking the risks involved in doing that. And not everybody can. It's one of the things, too. It's something that, you can go out and, be successful, perhaps, and popular and all that, but to do the sort of thing he's talking about is not necessarily the same.
Closing thought, perhaps, would be, with great freedom comes great responsibility, but with great responsibility, if you take it, can come great freedom. And, Gary, we've got a lot more to say about...
I know, that's this chapter 1.
Yeah, exactly. We've got a lot more to say about the life and work of Colin Wilson, and indeed your own work. So we're going to turn this into a little bit of a mini-series, but for today, we're going to wrap this one up. Just to remind everyone, we've been talking about your book published last year. It's called Beyond the Robot, The Life and Work of Colin Wilson. That's widely available. And I say people should, this is part 1, people who tune in for part 2 will be available very soon. Before we wrap up for today, is there anything you'd like to share? Obviously your website, just anything else you'd like to put out there.
Just if you, want to know anything more about my work or Colin's, as Greg said, my website's garylachman.co.uk. You can find links to this book, Beyond the Outsider, and other books as well.
Splendid. And is there a particular Colin Wilson website that you'd recommend? Colin Wilson World is the one that I'm aware of. If people want to immediately dive into some of his work, would you point...
Yeah, there's Colin Wilson World. I think there's Colin Wilson Online. And I think there's another one called, Phenomenology of Excess. But I'm wondering if that may be Colin Wilson World. There's also a Facebook. And if anyone's interested... if you check out Paupers Press, they have a website. If you just put Paupers Press in Google, you'll find it. this is Colin Stanley, and he publishes a lot of rare, sort of Wilsoniana sorts of things, and you might be interested, which the real connoisseurs out there might want to know about that.
Okay, well, listeners can find all of the above-mentioned links on the interview page for this show at legalizefreedom.com. So in the meantime, until next time, thanks once again, Gary, for joining us today on legalizefreedom.com.
Thank you for having me, Greg.